Okay, so I guess we'll get started here for this afternoon session. First up, God bless you all. Glad to be able to be here for this event and be able to meet each one of you. It's a little bit of a homecoming thing every year. Got to get to see a lot of the reps again and a lot of the trustees. I look forward to it, even though that April is pretty busy month. Quite some time ago, one thing that I wanted to mention to you first, by the way, is that when we were at Eastern Camp that year, I was the counselor of these boys. It wasn't near as nice as the picture that Bob painted of the University of Michigan. We were up in those ranch-shack cottages that were halfway up the hill at Massanutten Springs. You remember, you walk up through the woods and sort of at the bottom of the hill, there were these little white infested things over there. That's where we were for the week, and there are things that happened during that week that are just between me and the boys. But I'm planning on the fact that those that come after me are going to be bigger than me. That's my prayer. That's my absolute prayer. That those follow after will be bigger. So the leadership here of the foundation contacted me sometime on this particular topic. And the one that I've written down here might be a little bit different than the one in your book, because I took the one off of the email that Brother Thad sent to me, and I think he might have printed this a slight bit different in your book. But the teaser that I have here is dreams and visions, what is of God and what is not. And we're going to evaluate discernment. This statement says, as we draw closer to a time when the enemy will deceive through visions and dreams, how to tell which are authentically from the Lord. So after Brother Thad sent this to me, he and I went back on forth on this a little bit as to whether or not the teaser was actually biblically accurate. Because the supposition of the teaser, it says that as the time will come when the enemy will deceive through visions and dreams. So we were looking at the scriptures with each other and trying to decide, is that what the Bible teaches us? I mean, we know as the end times will come that there will be deception, no problem there. But the question is, does the Bible teach that they're going to come through dreams? And so we looked at this at quite a bit with each other, and I'm going to try to take this in a direction that stays with the theme of the thing, maybe in a little bit different way. But I hope to speak about some of the subtleties of dreams. And how, with those things in mind, the teacher might be absolutely accurate. So, by the way, I deliberately decided that I'm not going to make any PowerPoints for several different reasons. I'm PowerPointed out in life. After probably having created several hundred to maybe 1,000 PowerPoints, I'm done with PowerPoints. And I thought, if I can't bring the thing across in my words, it probably wasn't worth you to remember it anyway. So and this particular topic, I don't think that it's that seminal, to be honest with you, that it required, something to really be written down. But let me tell you where we're going to go with this a little bit. We're going to be looking at different ideas about what dreams really are. We're going to be looking at what the Scripture says about deception. And in terms of vetting ideas or dreams that we have that might be consistent or inconsistent with the Lord, I would like to use one biblical example that turned out really good about a dream that somebody had, a kind of dream that somebody had, that actually didn't turn out to be what they hoped, because of the Lord intervening in their life, and how they subordinated themselves to God's idea of being different than theirs. So you might guess here that we're talking about David's dream of creating a temple. And this is a special kind of dream that we're going to get to, the subtleties of this. So let me say this. So when you look up, at least in Merriam-Webster, dictionary about the topic of dreams, even as a noun, you're going to find that there are a lot of different definitions of dreams. Okay? And the first one, of course, that we normally think of is, a series of thoughts or images or emotions occurring during sleep. Okay, that's normally when we talk about dreams. There actually is a slightly different variant of dreams that I would like to focus on today, and that would be a different definition, which is a strongly desired goal or purpose is a dream. Now, in our generations, or those of you along with me that remember the 60s, in our culture, what would be maybe the strongest example, do you think, of a strongly desired goal or purpose? Somebody saying something that was a slight bit important right in front of the Lincoln Memorial on a great day in 19, right? Right? I have a dream today. I have a dream today, right? And when Martin Luther King said that, he was obviously not referring to a physical dream that he had one night, right? He was talking about a dream that he had that was a strong desire or purpose of what American culture could be from a racial, ethnic point of view. So I would like you to keep that idea in mind of a dream, because I think that sort of dream is going to be a little bit more relevant to us. One of the things that I ask myself is because you only think it's practical. And I had to ask myself, in our circles, how frequent is it that somebody might have had a dream, like a sleeping dream, and that dream really having been a deception in some way, that later on in the course of time others believed was somehow a false teaching? It might have happened, don't know. But there's none that jumps out to my mind, and I don't really think that it is a very operative thing among us in that regard. It's not something that we're constantly faced with, right? People claiming to have dreams that are somehow disbelieving or false. But I mentioned about subtleties in this topic. This might be more applicable, if we look at this other definition and say, well, for all of us, do we have sometimes, strong desired goals or purposes in our life that might also involve some level of misunderstanding or some level of having a wrong view in life? They're not deceptive in a cynical kind of way, but, we might have imaginations in life of what our life is going to be like, or imaginations about how our kids are going to turn out, or imaginations about a burden that the Lord has given us for a given ministry that we would like to see fruit come from. And then when life comes out, it might happen that way, it might not happen that way. And we'll go back and refining, in our own minds, what were the pieces actually that brought this out in a good way or not. So I'm not going to read a lot of these verses, but I do want to, at least for the sake of clarity, bring some of them to your mind in case you want to write some of them down. What the Old Testament teaches about levels of people who taught wrong things that supposedly came from dreams, and the question is, what kind of dreams did they come from? Okay, we automatically assume they were from the sleeping kinds of dreams. I don't think so, and I'll point out to you why I don't think so. But some of these verses that might come to mind that are a little bit about deception, I'd just like to read two from you, from Lamentations chapter 2, verse 14, as an example. The Bible teaches us that thy prophets have seen vain and foolish things for thee, and they have not discovered thine iniquity to turn away thy captivity, but have seen for thee false burdens and causes of banishment. So this verse doesn't use the word dreams, but it talks about foolish things. They have seen vain and foolish things for thee. So we're not really sure what manner did that come about. But obviously, in whatever was being expressed to people, it wasn't with the kind of clarity and teaching that God wanted, right? They didn't bring across what God wanted them to hear. Or, for example, if we look at Jeremiah 4, verse 10, and then said I, Lord God, surely thou hast greatly deceived this people in Jerusalem, saying, Ye shall have peace, whereas the sword reacheth unto the soul. So here, this kind of deception is more on the level of a false prophecy, of so looking into the future and saying, well, I think this is going to happen, and it turned out not at all to happen that way. Okay, and maybe people were deceived a little bit by, in this case, giving the impression that peaceful times were going to be coming, and it turned out they should have been doing something else and not preparing for peaceful times. Okay, again, dreams are not mentioned. Let me bring out for you several verses in the New Testament, and I'm not going to read these. I'm just going to recite these to you, or make mention of these verses that speak about level of end-time deceptions. As an example, in Thessalonians 2, verses 9 to 12, 2 Timothy 3, the whole chapter, 2 Peter 1 and 2, speak about different kinds of misperceptions in the future. 2 Peter 3, verse 4, Zechariah 10, 2. These are in the general category of deceptions that will come to God's people, but none of them say anything about dreams. I would like to come now to a group of 3 that are all from the book of Jeremiah. Okay, and these do mention the word dreams, but we're going to look with each other and try to understand what this really means. Is this sleep dreams? I think it falls into the latter category of stated goals and purposes. So I'm going to read these in a certain order to you first. This is from Jeremiah 23, verse 32. And it says, "Behold, I am against them that prophesy false dreams, saith the Lord, and do tell them, and cause my people to err by their lies, and by their lightness. Yet I sent them not, nor commanded them, therefore they shall not profit this people at all, saith the Lord." So this verse makes mention of prophesying of false dreams in verse 32 of this chapter, and it speaks about, causing people to err from lies and from the lightness that they had over things that should have been more heavier, and it just says that the people don't profit from these kinds of things. Now, we might think, well, this could be true. Could be. Let's look back now 5 verses before that, in Jeremiah 23, verse 27. The Bible says, "Which think to cause my people to forget my name by their dreams, which they tell every man to his neighbor, as their fathers have forgotten my name, for Baal." So this is actually speaking something now about dreams that people have that they're always talking to their neighbor about, and somehow in those dreams the Lord's has been forgotten, and somehow the name of Baal has come about in this. So I'm not really sure that it's talking about dreams that one had in their sleep. Sounds to me like that's talking about a different kind of teaching in this. A few chapters later, Jeremiah 29:8, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, let not your prophets and your diviners that be in the midst of you deceive you, neither hearken to your dreams which ye caused to be dreamed." Now, who here has ever had a dream that you could make yourself dream? Can you do that? I can't make myself dream a dream. Dreams just happen. This is talking about, dreams that you made yourself dreams that sure, to my mind, speak more to the category of having a desired goal or a desired purpose that they had in their life, that now became a life theme, became a dream in that sense of something that they were going to pursue. Okay, so, the theme as is presented to us here too in the teaser was, how can we avoid what is of God and what is not of God, and how can we tell what is authentically coming from the Lord? I would like to weave into this. Let's look at the beautiful example of David and the dream that David had of building the temple, and we're going to look into that and try to understand David's motives and what were what was all part of this. This, of course, is in 2 Samuel 7.
Say it again.
2 Samuel 7. Okay, if you want to look at this in the first 11 verses. And this, to my mind, is an example that might befall you and I of a godly man with a good heart that had a great idea. A godly man with a good heart that had a great idea. And yet it turned out, as this panned out, that David, of course, wanted to do this for the glory of God. And it didn't work out according to what he had in mind. And, this might be symptomatic of an idea that we have, of a good idea that we bring to God with a good heart, of something that we would like to see happen, and then it doesn't come to fruition for any number of reasons. Now, I want to make it clear, so this is not on the level of a deception. It's not that David was deceived. But to be honest, I think in your and my experience, that's more of the kinds of things that we have. It's not that a good thing that we would want to do, that we've been deceived in following after that thing. There might be other things in God's thinking and in His plan that causes that not to work out. And the question is, how do we respond to life's events where, with the godly intent and with a good heart, wanting to do a great thing with a great idea, that it doesn't turn out that way? And how does God work in our lives this way? Well, we'll read these verses with each other, and I would like to at least point out to you, to emphasize a few things as I'm going to read these 11 verses from 2 Samuel that I believe are important in the narrative. And by the way, I want to mention ahead of time that David did 4 things right. And these 4 things that he did right are maybe a good process or litmus test for us of trying to decide what from the Lord is authentic. What are things that God would really want us to do, even though David did all these things right, and the answer was still no. It was still no. So let's read the verses with each other from 2 Samuel 7. And it came to pass, when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him, I'm going to underline these words now, pay attention here, the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies. Take note of where those enemies were. Round about. The Lord had given him rest, but those enemies were round about. They surrounded him. Take note of that. That the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in an house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. And Nathan said to the king, Go, do all that is in thy heart, for the Lord is with thee. And it came to pass that night, that the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, Go and tell my servant David, Thus saith the Lord, Shalt thou build me an house for me to dwell in? Whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, even unto this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. In all the places wherein I have walked, with all the children of Israel, spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, Why build ye not me an house of cedar? Now therefore, so shalt thou say unto my servant David, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I took thee from a sheepcote, from following the sheep, to be a ruler over my people, over Israel. And I was with thee, whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off all thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of great men that are in the earth. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as before time. And as since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thine enemies, also the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee house. So again, an example of a godly man with a good heart that had a great idea. And now he had to come to grips with whether or not that idea really met God's needs. Now, if you read what other people say about this, there's cynical ways that we can do this as well. Well, perhaps it was David's pride. Perhaps really that was at root here, that this thing was simply going to be for somebody else. Perhaps David had, maybe David did something wrong, so God chose him out of it. The reason why you got to know in your life is maybe because you did something wrong. Easy to jump to those conclusions. Maybe David was being presumptuous. And he was moving ahead of God. And God didn't like that. These are all imaginations that we could have about this. But when we read the word, none of these things come out in Scripture. That he was prideful, that he was presumptuous, or that he had done anything wrong. Not that these questions are wrong to ask, but the Bible doesn't teach us any of these things. 4 principles that David had in his heart that he got right, that can be a litmus test for us in trying to discern what is of God and what is not of God in our life. David had the right concern. David had the right goal. David had the right heart. And David used the right process in trying to decide what God wanted. He nevertheless got a no at the end, and we're going to talk about that, because that is some of the deepest challenges of our faith being tested, sometimes in life, when we get a no to a good thing, to a great thing. And maybe that is sometimes where we meet the most deception in life, when we're faced with a no. That is difficult, very difficult for us to swallow. Why did the no come from this? So David had the right concern. If we look at verse 2 with each other, when we see here what David told Nathan, he made this point and said, "See now, I dwell in an house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains." Now, he had a very, very right concern that any honest man of conscience needs to ask themselves when we see, Father, in the things that you've blessed me with and you've given me in my life, and this is what I have, and then I go to the place where we worship you, and I see what that place is like, and I can't live with my conscience. The way I live and the way that we worship you don't match with each other. I can't live with the fact that we have meager attitudes in the way we come to you, and lavish attitudes in the way that we choose to live out our own lives with each other. In fact, we can also find, if you would look in the book Haggai, in verse in chapter 1, verse 4, this is exactly what the prophet Haggai challenged Israel with, saying that they had the wrong concern in their life. He said, "Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in sealed houses, and this house lie waste?" You see, he exactly challenged them with the fact that the way they lived did not match up with the way they served God and the place that they worshipped Him. So this was, of course, the right kind of concern that God challenged them with, and David had it right. He realized that God had given him very, very much, and he really felt in his heart that as God has given me, so should we give back to God in like manner. David had the right goal. He had the right goal. We read in verse 5, and this is what God reported back to him through Nathan, of course. "Go and tell my servant David, thus saith the Lord, shalt thou build me a house for me to dwell in." So let me put that in a little bit more common English. God did not say that it was the wrong goal to build him a house. The emphasis of that word is you. Should you build me a house? It wasn't saying he had the wrong goal in building a house. The question is, should you build me that house? And this is sometimes a difficult thing in life, and all of us match up with this. Can you imagine? He had this great idea, and he brings it before God, and then he hears the answer from God, in essence, "You've got the right goal, but I will raise a different servant to do that for me, not you." Talk about being scooped, right? Talk about being the first one to be on the scene with something that you imagine was something that could be great, and then, it turns out a great idea, but no of. Now, of course, David was blessed with the fact that he found out only later from God that it would be his son. His son that would do it. Now, I'm sure that there was some redemption in that David, would know that, well, it's going to be from his immediate kin that would go ahead and do that. That somehow was a little bit of a silver lining in this thing. But the goal was right. David had the right heart. He had the right heart. If you would go to a similar passage in 1 Kings 8, verse 18, and this is Solomon speaking now retroactively about what God told his father David. Solomon wrote, "And the Lord said unto David my father, whereas it is in thine heart to build an house unto my name, thou doest well that is in thine heart." Thou doest well that is in thine heart. The heart that David had in this was absolutely the right thing. And of course, David took the right process. He wasn't going to act on his own. What did he do? We read with each other verse 2 about it. The first thing that he did with this is he went to God's oracle. He goes to Nathan, who was the man regarded as speaking with the voice of God, and he tells Nathan what his plans are. And the answer that he gets from Nathan, you can't get a stronger endorsement. And Nathan said to him, "Go and do all that is in thine heart." Do all that is in thine heart. And then he gets back a no. So we're going to talk about the no, but I want to emphasize these 4 points, again, in terms of vetting dreams that we might have in life of whether or not they're of the Lord. And there are more questions than we could ask than these 4. But these are 4 useful questions that we can ask with each other, that what ultimately is the concern that is underlying what it is that one wants to do? What ultimately is the goal that one wants to achieve with whatever it is that you've set out to do? What is the heart of the individual in trying to set out what they want to do? And what is the process that has been used in moving down the road with that? Now, we're often going to find out that even let's say in the example in the Old Testament, that it was sleeping dreams that were wrong. we're going to find out here that those 4 principles would have been violated, at least one or multiple of them. That what was spoken was not in the right heart. It was not with the right goal. It was not with the right concern. It was not with the right process of trying to vet what it is that God wanted. So I think that those 4 things can be useful to us in looking at this. And we're going to be looking in this sense that, what are the kind of wrong dreams that we sometimes have in our lives that God closes the door to? And how we respond to God closing the door. I'm hoping that this will be a very useful thing for you in your life. 2 things are for sure the case. When God says no, your faith will be tested. Your faith will be tested in several different ways when you get a no back. We're going to look at that in detail. And the other thing is, when God says no, His promises to you stand sure. Even in the face of no. Even in the face of no. About our faith being tested. A few points about this in the face of no. Now, we all probably have committed these verses to memory, which we should. As the good Jews that we are. As the good Jews that we are. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. We really want to live out these words, don't we? I mean, in all fairness before God, we want to live out these words. And it speaks to our love for God. So let me ask some questions now about how much we really love God, and how that is brought out in no answers in life. Will our love for God be the same whether or not He gives us the thing that we want? Will our love for Him be the same whether or not He gives the thing that we want? So, let me give you an example. I mean, they got this example, but Brother Jeff told me today something very interesting. He's got something like this going on with Sister Deborah. I won't go into details with that, but, a surprise is being planned somehow or other. A surprise is being planned. So, let me tell you, I go to Miriam and I say, Miriam, I think that we should go shopping tomorrow, and I'd like to get something for you. And she says to me, well, why? It's not Christmas, it's not my birthday, it's not Valentine's Day. And I say, well, that's okay. I just, I'd like to get something for you. Okay, I'm not smart enough to have done this, okay, but this is, follow along, I'd like to get something for you. And so we go to the store the next day, and just because. And then we go to the store, and I see something there, and I say to her, oh, you know what, Miriam, I'd like to get you this cheese board. And then she says to me, well, if you're going to be getting something for me anyway, I'd actually prefer something else. And I say to her, well, no, that's okay. I'd like to get you this cheese board. And she said, well, I think I'd really prefer to get something else. And then I said, no, I insist. I want to get you this cheese board. Well, of course, in the way that this pans out, I'm not conducting myself in a way in which I really love her, right? Even though I've convinced myself that I want to do something nice for her, Love at some point has ultimately been broken when I'm insisting that I want to do a good thing, but it's the thing that I want to do that I'm going to give you. Right? Whereas true love in this would actually realize that even if I want to do a good thing, in doing the good thing, the operative thing here is that one wants to give the thing that she wants. Right? That's the way love ultimately is expressed, in the thing that she wants, not the thing that I want to give her. I would no longer really be acting in love in giving her the gift that I wanted to give her. Right? I would not be acting in love. And this is exactly the place that David found himself. Right? In wanting to give something that he thought was going to be good, and then God saying in the end, but that's not what I want. And you're always going to be faced with the same question as I will when God says no, that ultimately how we live out Deuteronomy 6 is going to be challenged. And that's in the end, are we going to show the same kind of love for God when we do the thing that he wants, or when we do the thing that you want, when you live out your dream, your purpose, whatever that might be? Do we have a sense of gladness and a sense of peace into laying into his hand the thing that he wants? Like real gladness and real peace for giving the thing that one wants. The reason why I emphasized here this verse 1, in that he was given rest round about for all his enemies. Round about from all his enemies that were round about. And you realize if we would be reading after this in the scripture, we find that the battles were not over. They were not over. There were still battles to be fought. And to undertake a huge building project like one did, is suddenly if you get into a war, the first thing that happens is all these things have to be put on hold. And notice, even though it was a moment of rest, the scripture says that David was surrounded. He was surrounded by the enemies. Still. And God knew that for the security of Israel to be had, those enemies had to be subdued. They would need to be driven out before the time would come where something like a 10-year project of a large temple could be undertaken. And so David's role in this particular moment was that his greatest contribution was to subdue the enemies. And at that point, the great desire of his heart could happen. Now, the temple could not have been built in the middle of a war. And sometimes we can't hold on to the things that we want to get. Now, how does that relate to us in our given time? For those that are involved in the foundation, here's one thing that I would like to lay in your heart, those that are interested in the work of the foundation. That you know what? We all would like to have something important laid in our lives that we really think is important for the kingdom. Whatever you think that might be. And we all have a desire to want to do something that the Lord could really use and really bless in some kind of a big way for his purpose. And we all sort of wish that one would be on the front line of whatever that blessing, whatever that action would be. And I'm so glad that we are at sort of an evolutionary stage in the institution of our church where there is a greater interest and understanding and desire to do the things of the work of the kingdom for spreading the gospel. This is clearly a deeper need among us. I'm really, really glad for that. And yet the reality is that for most of us, we probably are not going to be on the front line of making that happen. Very few. But do we also realize, if one would have, an ambition to go ahead and do this, that in this time also, there is a need for the enemies to be subdued. I mean, that is to say, the scene needs to be set still in life for great things to happen. Financial resources yet need to be provided for for great things to happen before the kingdom. The trustee brothers have realized that even in the institutional strength that they have, that building up stronger institutional structures with other levels of oversight and other levels of decision-making processes and other levels of guidance, charters, ideas about how this will be governed and how this will be done, all those things yet lie ahead. We don't have the infrastructure of having all of these things laid out. In that regard, it's like the enemies needing to be subdued around us that are still surrounding us. And there's still work on others' part to lie ahead, to set the scene for these other things to be able to happen. Could you imagine a time also when we see others that I had the idea, it was my idea, and God is blessing another to bring about my idea? Then we are challenged in our faith with how much do we love others? Do we really love others? Really love others as we love ourselves? Or we're being deceived that the dream is our dream and not ultimately God's dream? Because if it's God's dream, it doesn't matter who the person is, right? It doesn't. So could you imagine, as an example, a soccer game that we're playing where the team members have equal joy, really equal joy, no matter who puts the ball on the back of the net. It doesn't matter who puts the ball on the back of the net. Everybody shares equal joy with each other about the fact that the ball actually is put in the back of the net. How much do we love someone else that scores a goal in life? And are really, really happy that the goal got scored because of who they were and because of what they did. Do we have as much joy when a blessing is given to somebody else as if it really had been given to us in our lives? Really equal joy that the blessing has been given. Can we really rejoice with that person who was given the solo, so to speak, in the choir? And we have these events when we get together and solos are given out. And they're very rare, but one amongst us sings the solo. And really be very happy for the one who ultimately sings the solo. Could you imagine, now here's one that cuts deeper. Could you imagine where we as a faith and we as ministers, instead of criticizing others, where we also have as much joy when we see God blessing another church or God blessing another fellowship as if it had been our fellowship? Those of us that are in growing smaller churches, right? Or we are already in smaller churches, and we see the larger churches that are flourishing, and it's easy to jump on the kind of bandwagon of the what about us, me too? What about something that great happens to a church that's down the block? We know nothing about them, and they might believe differently than we believe, but can one really rejoice when God in some way does something really, really good through them, and one can rejoice as if He had worked that work through me? Our love for God will be tested when He says no and actually calls someone else to do the thing that we want. Do we really understand God's grace when that happens? Do you know how soft and tender God was? Did you catch this when He gave the no? When He gave the no. Along with the no came this. He said, David, I took you from being a shepherd, and I raised you from being a shepherd to this place where you are right now. I did this for you, and I've been faithful to you, and I've been active in your life in how I have moved you from here to there. And by the way, your desire for Israel, I will provide a place where Israel will worship. I will do these things. All of this is going to wind up happening for you in your life. It will happen. That's God's grace, of reminding us how, even in the face of a no, what he has done with us for where we could be. Why is it, as an example, brothers and sisters, why is it that there are millions that are outside, that are without? But you are within the fold. You are within the fold. And you could be somebody else, but you're not. You are within the fold of grace and within the fold of redemption. You know, somehow in life, it tends to be the case that our joy is somehow deeply linked at times for what we can do for him. It's one of these ironies in life that we all deal with. Our joy is deeply linked with what we can do for him, instead of realizing that our joy in life should be much more deeply linked with what he has done for us, not what we're doing for him. But why is that we get a sense of accomplishment, a sense of purpose, a sense of validation? By looking at the things that I might want to do for him, the plans that I have, the goals, the ideas that I have. I'd like to close actually with just bringing one verse to your mind, one other anecdote that I hope is going to speak to you in life. You know, you remember the case in Luke 10 when Jesus did an amazing thing to his disciples. He gave them power. He gave them power to go out in his name and to heal and to preach and to do things. They were endowed with this. And they went out and did, and they came back so excited. Like, wow. Lord, we came back and we did these things, and I mean, this was awesome. This was awesome. How your power worked, that we could cast out devils in your name. And all of these things happened. And then Jesus comes with seemingly this cup of cold water on the whole thing, but it's much deeper than that. It's much deeper than that. You remember what he said, right? No, notwithstanding in these things rejoice not, that the spirits are subject unto you, but rejoice rather, because your names are written in the book of life. See, this is exactly the point. They got so excited because of the things that they could do for God. And it's the things ultimately in life that God does for us that are the things that really should bring the greatest joy, the greatest satisfaction, the greatest sense of fulfillment, the greatest sense of purpose, the greatest sense of a token for his love. Oh, and by the way, you know, when you get the no in your life, the immediate thing that we come to is either we've done something wrong, or even worse than that. I say worse than that, but it's so common. Doesn't God love me? Doesn't he love me? If he would love me, I would get the yes. If he would really love me, I would get the yes. But he came back with the no. And then we ask, does he really love me? And this really speaks to the point of whether or not we really understand his grace, of what he has done for us that far outweighs this thing that we would like. So, does anybody know who Martin Lloyd-Jones is? Name when you go to. Martin Lloyd-Jones.
He was a famous preacher.
So not only was he a famous preacher, but you know, this is astounding for us in America to show we really don't understand other English-speaking cultures. Do you know that Martin Lloyd-Jones was the preacher of the 20th century that Charles Spurgeon was of the 19th century? And we in America, we know something of Charles Spurgeon, and some people might know of Martin Lloyd-Jones. His collected volumes are called the Westminster Pulpit, right? But somehow we're not connecting with it. In his day, Lloyd-Jones, as he was called, was the most revered preacher, expositor of the word in England. And at the end of his life, Lloyd-Jones became ill, feeble, sickly, constant visits. I mentioned this story recently. Sorry, I've kind of heard this again, but I mentioned this in a sermon the other week in a different context. But Lloyd-Jones was visits back and forth to the hospital, some recuperating and convalescing back to the hospital again. And his longtime biographer wrote of this, Ian Murray, of some of his last visits that he had to Martin Lloyd-Jones, and in one of the last, and he wrote this in his biography. When he visited Lloyd-Jones, told him that, you know, the greatest deception that we have in life is, he put it this way, to live on activity. To live on activity. And he said the greatest test of the preacher, this is Lloyd-Jones saying this now, the greatest test of the preacher is what he feels when he can no longer preach. When he can no longer preach. And this is exactly getting to the point of Luke 10:20. Rejoice not in this, but rejoice that your names are written in the book of life. But when God gives you the note. Now this touches very deeply on the talk that Judah gave before of our own visions of the American dream, our own visions for our own life, our visions for our children, our visions for our ministry, our visions for the eternal good that will come out of whatever it is that we are doing. You know, what is the kind of deception that we might have sometimes in the value of these things? You know, do we understand that our calling at our point in life might be different than the calling that we had imagined? And by the way, Solomon could only have built the temple after David has subdued the enemies round about. It could only have happened in that order. And you know, this the little humorous anecdote that I started out with, and I really mean this when I said that those that come after me, I hope they're bigger than me. I mean, I wish that for Bob, and I wish that for John. But you know, when I look at my children, and when I look at my church, or others that come after me, I really hope and pray that they're going to be greater men of God than I could manage to be. Trying really to be the man that God wants me to be in that regard. But my hope would really still be that God will use those who follow after me with the kind of faith teaching that I can give them, that they would be better prepared. And you know what? I want to be active in subduing the enemies round about that God has given me right now, if that's what my calling is, in order to be able to provide a path for them to be able to do the other things that will really be of value for the kingdom. And how can I protect myself from having my own wrong dreams and my own deceptions about the things in life that I think are important, and maybe the disappointments that I've harbored in life, thinking that these were important things, and only coming to realize that they weren't important at all. There were other things in life that are much, much more important than the kind of disappointments that one has in this way or the other. And not being deceived by the things in life that would carry us down, take us down, make us feel small, discourage us, make us feel a failure, the things that sometimes would depress, and the things that might dismay, and the things that might disappoint. That in the greater scheme of things, we fooled ourselves into trying to understand what really was the value of this thing that one wanted to do. There are other things that are much greater. So, you know, I did want to just open it up. I mean, we have just a few minutes. You know, in the event that I miss the mark, and it happens sometimes, I miss the mark. I don't know, maybe there are examples of those actually having sleeping dreams that somehow they found to be deceptive. Or having, you know, did I miss the teaching? Was there something else in the scripture that was there that spoke to that point? Brother Thad and I worked on this with each other, and we gave it a really honest effort, you know, to look at what was there. And you know, I'm hoping that this slightly different angle of the subtleties of our dreams and how we might be deceived with those might be somewhat of a more practical and common thing, you know, amongst us as we try to live our life before the Lord and bring about some fruit for the kingdom in whatever way. Thoughts, points, and Dave?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for sharing the word with us and for your interpretation of it in this instance. I was also thinking of David's response to all of this, that he did not go away sad, disappointed, but he made it possible by giving so much of his treasure, gold, silver, wood, etc., to see that Solomon could be successful in this. So, and God didn't say you can't do that, but he allowed him. And it shows me that David did not say, well, Solomon, you build it, you're on your own. No, David made possibility, which tells us about his heart and how he went about and responded to the no.
Thanks very much, David. I should have made that point clear, but thank you for... Aren't you glad this story is in the Bible?
Yeah.
Aren't you glad that this story is there? I mean, what a great example, you know, of David actually coming to grips with all the right things that were lined up and getting the no, and yet still moving ahead with expectancy and with faith of what God ultimately was going to do, and the beautiful silver lining in the end for him to know that it was going to happen to be his son. It was the one that God was going to call in order to make this happen. Thanks very much for emphasizing that point.
Could you elaborate on the last part you were quoting from Martin Lloyd-Jones and how he said that it wasn't that it's not about activity, but that what he felt?
Right, I can read you the quote if you want, or I can give it to you later. The ultimate test of a preacher is what he feels when he can no longer preach. He's no longer able to preach. And you know what? This is not about being a preacher. You can take this into any you know. One finds a great purpose in healthcare and has committed their life to that. And it lasts for a time and then it ends. And then you can say, you know, the greatest test of a doctor or of a nurse is what they feel when they can no longer practice medicine. The greatest test of a teacher is what they feel when they can no longer teach. Because it ultimately is the litmus test of whether or not we live on the activity and we get the joy for the activity. When we can do it, then we're glad and happy and satisfied. But when we can no longer do it, then the kind of satisfaction that came with it goes away. And how that great temptation is there for us to live on activity. And once those things are no longer there, that one can't find the joy anymore. But Lloyd-Jones, he could. Even though he couldn't preach anymore, God's purpose and God's expectation, what God did for him, was just as real to him when there was not one person that could hear his preaching anymore. And that, to my mind, is a real victory in faith. It's a real victory in faith, if we can come to that point. And, are you satisfied with that answer, or you're not satisfied with that answer?
I'm satisfied with it, and I agree to it in part. I guess I'm just cautious with the word feeling. And that I think the feeling part of it, because we live in a culture where everything is, oh, I feel this way, I feel that way. And a lot of times we cannot trust our feelings, but we have to remind ourselves of the truth of the Word of God. And essentially you're saying that the feeling is, the test of the person's character is not in their activity, you know, but in their relationship with God.
That's another way of saying it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, we're coming right to the top of the hour, and thanks very much. I hope it spoke to you in some way. Lord bless you.
Thank you.